So it's a pleasure today to welcome Stan Rosenberg to come as our speaker. He founds and directs the organisation in Oxford, SCIO, which stands for Scholarship and Christianity in Oxford. He's a member of Wycliffe Hall and of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, teaching history and doctrine and science and religion. He has a background in history originally, and his research and teaching interests focus on Augustine's works, early Christian cosmology and its relation to Greco-Roman science, culture, and philosophy. And today he's going to be talking to us on Can Nature Be Read in Tooth and Claw? You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join you all. It's a pleasure. I'm also part of the Ian Ramsey Center at Oxford, so as a sibling organization of sorts, good to be here with Faraday. So, this lecture came out of work that I did, and it's work that I did that came out of a type of almost personal crisis, if you will, as I dealt with science and religion, where a challenge that presented itself to me early one morning when I woke up out of the blue thinking, I've got a conflict that I've got to contend with. There's a potential internal conflict to how I'm handling core issues. And it's just one of those things that dawned upon me, where I hadn't thought about it. I've been working for some years. And then one of those insights that came that there is a significant issue that I've got to contend with. So this is a topic that has been important to me. And took several years to work through and think through in a number of ways, and yet built off the other work that I had done. I had done my foundational work on Augustine's commentaries on Genesis, of which I'll talk about more in a bit. But I think it's important to remember a phrase. My father was a historian, a medievalist. Actually, he got his start here at Cambridge. He was with the U.S. Bomber Group during World War II and was based nearby and came to a book stall in Cambridge while he was with the Bomber Group. I was just reading through my late father's notes on this actually this week. And he found an 1825 edition of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and that set him on his path. And he switched from planning to go to Princeton and being trained as a Reformed cleric and became a medievalist. And I inherited a bit of the family tradition, or business, as the case may be. But he used to say a phrase to me, which it's really important to remember. And in the challenge I faced, I forgot this core fatherly wisdom, key bit of fatherly wisdom, and it comes out in this painting. So this painting, which I came across, not through its original title and proper title by Carpaccio, the Visione di San Agostino, I came across in a book on art history that described it simply as Augustine in his study. And if you're interested in the history of science and science religion, well, there's a lot of red meat for you here, right? So some of you will recognize things. So what do you see there? And a number of you will recognize what these are? Can you tell? Astrolabes in the cabinet. This is what they thought, this is what, in the Renaissance, what they thought an educated pastor should be having around them. Things have changed perhaps a bit. You can't see it down there, but there's a nocturnal for looking at the night sky. There's an hourglass, and then really critically, what's up there? Anyone recognize that? It's a little bit hard in the light. It's an armillary sphere. The depiction of the heavens. By the way, if any of you have come with the idea that the medievals thought the world was flat, all you have to do is look at our armillary sphere to recognize that that's not the case, or almost any bit of medieval artwork. So I had this, for the long dark night of the soul, that all of us in the room who've done dissertations know as dissertating. I had this printed out and sitting above my desk during my period of dissertation to inspire and encourage. And I could imagine it, I didn't think it literally was, but I could imagine it being Augustine working through his commentary on Genesis. There he is, reflecting, he's looking out at this. I'm thinking about the vision of Augustine. He's got the commentary on Genesis ends with a sense of a vision, the contemplative life. So he's the title, the sense of a vision and reflection. He's looking out the study. And so I didn't literally think that Augustine was working on Genesis, but it was just a nice inspirational bit of artwork to keep me engaged as I was trying to survive doing my work. And soon after I moved to England in 1999, my family and I went to Venice, and I was able to go see this painting in situ, which is in the Scola to the Dalmatian Sailors. And that's when I was reminded of my father's cogent fatherly wisdom, that a text without a context is a pretext. The historian's device, because this painting actually has nothing to do with Augustine, nothing to do with Genesis. Well, it has a little bit to do with Augustine, but it's actually part of a cycle of 10 paintings on the life of Jerome. And it's the penultimate painting in cycle. Each of these paintings is massive, about the size, larger than this whole wall, and the Scola is quite a small building, and these 10 paintings are around the upper register of the Scola, painted around it, typical of a Renaissance artwork. And so you have these paintings on the life of Jerome, and there's Jerome with the golden legend with the lion, and there you have the death of Jerome. If you know anything about Augustine, you know that Augustine and Jerome were, you wouldn't call them necessarily enemies, but erstwhile opponents. And Augustine is the great young scholar, the inspirational scholar who had caught many people's imagination and attention. Jerome, the scholarly, stodgy, biblical interpreter. And they didn't have a happy relationship in many instances. And so what you have is Augustine reflecting about Jerome and the life and the challenges. That's nothing to do with Genesis. And that's, I think, my experience of that, and combined with my father's wisdom, is insight. I think it's important for many of these subjects we come to as we're engaging with science and religion, as we're wrestling through topics. Because as I was engaging with this problem of how I wrestle through Augustine and Genesis, actually I won't come to that yet. I hit a particular challenge, which was understanding a sense of being cornered, because there was a tradition of interpreting Augustine, which neither of my mentors did. I had two great mentors in Augustine, Robert Marcus, late of Nottingham, and Gerald Bonner from Durham, who were two of the great Augustine scholars. And neither of them put me into this corner, but the broader materials out there did, despite their better efforts at training me. And so the tradition of interpreting Augustine that many hold and offer is that in the Confessions throughout his works, Augustine posits a sense of deep alienation, disassociation, dislocation, that we live a dislocated life. Well, so that's good. That does reflect Augustine. But the way it's commonly put is that we are alienated from God in the fall, and as alienated from God, therefore we're also going to be alienated within ourselves. You get that deep sense of alienation as you read the Confessions, the distortions that tear us apart internally, and so we don't see the world well or right. And if I can't see God and I'm alienated from God, I'm alienated from myself. Well, of course, I'm also going to be alienated from you. So there's social alienation. We have breakdown in society, and it's the fourth one, though, and how you interpret the fourth one becomes very critical. Because often you will have people say, indeed, scholars within the Reformed tradition like Al Wolters, and very famously John Hick, argue that Augustine thought the cosmos was alienated from God as a result of the fall. So the cosmos alienated as a result of the fall. And it's that next one which becomes a problem. And here's what my problem was. When I said I woke up and had this potential epiphany, this intuition that I had a contradiction. I'm a scholar of Augustine. I would put myself as somebody who's very much positively, I've found it anyway, to be positively shaped by the Augustinian theological tradition and work within frameworks of Augustine's thought. And I also engage with science and have no truck with, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I have friends like Dennis who are, and reading carefully their work, find that I can engage with it fully and fundamentally without problem. And yet I woke up one night thinking, how do I account for the climatic events? If we say that the world has gotten dislocated as a result of the fall, well, how do we account for issues like animal predation? before some sort of, whether you put it as a historic or prehistoric fall, but how do you account for issues like animal predation or cataclysms in nature, whether it be a volcanic eruption or tornadoes or disease? And so there's a fundamental problem that Christian theology has had to wrestle with. How do we manage an idea of a question of a fall together with what we understand about physical and biological evolution? And there was the nub of my conflict, that I couldn't seem to put these together. And as I first began this, I thought, does this mean I have to either restrict or somehow change my understanding of evolutionary science if I want to take this theological tradition seriously, or do I give up or change my theological tradition? It was posited to me, and posited to me by some very good people, that I was in an either-or situation, that it was a contradiction to hold both, and it was a fundamental dishonesty to hold both. So I came at this research then to figure out, do these statements cancel each other out? Have I set up a problem, or is there something more I can work with? Well, lest I assume you know too much about Augustine, let me back up and say a little bit about Augustine and set some context now that I've set up my problem that I want to address. First off, I want to say, as I'm working with this, I'm a historical theologian. I'm a historian who is wrestling through understanding what did people think, when, and why, and what were their influences, and how those influenced others. I'm not a systematician. I'm not positing. I think there are some very good answers that these give, but I'm not positing this is the best or right answer. But let's get it right. The historian's role is often sometimes like a gardener who has to start by weeding the garden. And so part of my job is to try and dig out the things, the mistakes, the problems, the interpretations that may or may not create havoc for us intellectually, culturally, socially. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is do, if you will, do a bit of weeding to understand what did Augustine think and what did that mean for the Augustinian tradition. So I think it's really important to say what I'm not doing, which is trying to posit the best possible answer. I'll leave it to you to judge whether you think this answer is fundamentally acceptable or essential or not. Well, a little bit about Augustine. Augustine was an extensive writer. I assume many of you will have come across his writings in one form or another, usually known for things like the Confessions, the City of God, or his work on Christian instruction, De Doctrina Christiana, sometimes called On Christian Doctrine. He was somebody who was influential and extensive, and whose influences changed at different times. So one of the things that's interesting to do is look at what influences, what works of his have been influential in different periods. So if you were to look at the time of Peter Lombard in the 13th, 14th century, and the lead up to the Renaissance, Augustine's commentaries on Genesis were some of his most influential works. How many of you have read De Genesi ad Litteram? Well, actually, that's quite impressive, but then I'm in Cambridge. And I even say that as an Oxford man. It's a work that rarely shows up, though, on reading lists today. It'd be rather surprising. Certainly you wouldn't find it in most undergraduate reading requirements in theology. And yet in the 13th to 15th centuries, it was one of his most influential works. If you look at citations in Lombard, it's cited second only to the City of God. That's how influential and important it was. So works, one of the things that's interesting to do as a historian is to track who's reading what when, which works. Not just are they reading Augustine, but which works of Augustine, or whichever scholar you're looking at, whether it's John of Damascus or Cyril or Gregory of Nazianzen. What are the works that are influential at given times? And it tells you something about the society and the people and the ideas. Well, Augustine, indeed, very influential. Shockingly gave somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 sermons. That's actually the most important part of his corpus. There are about almost 1,000, just shy of 1,000 of these that are still extant. I cut my teeth on comparing his interpretations of Genesis 1 to 3 in the extant sermons with his commentary, using that as a way to get at popular versus intellectual ideas of the world. So just to give you the context of time, since I'm a historian, born in 354, died in 430 AD. if you have any sense of the late antique world, you know this was a really critical time. This is during a period of vast transformation of the Roman world, the late antique world. So in 310 to 313 AD, at the end of another massive civil war, which was so defined much of Roman society, you had this young upstart out of York march on Rome and win a battle he shouldn't have won. That was Constantine, using the sign, the Key Road, the ancient Christian sign, as his moniker. And this led to a vast transformation over time. It didn't happen all at once, of course, but over time, a change of ways of thinking. And Augustine is born into this. And Augustine inherited the optimism of the Constantinian age and booknoted in some ways, because well into his episcopal career in 410 AD, the unthinkable happens when the Germanic tribes march on Rome and sack it and do what shouldn't have been done, that is, sack a Christian capital. That went against the kind of Christian optimism, the state-born optimism that was shaping the period. And so Augustine comes to critique that Eusebian tradition of optimism and moves from being, if you will, a court Constantinian to rejecting a notion of such easy coexistence between state and church. And that's what he's often well known for, although misread on as well. So, answering my problem, can I understand and engage with an Augustinian theological framework and maintain my engagement with physical and biological evolution, or do one of these have to alter? Well, we need to begin then thinking through issues of Augustine. So the first thing you know is that Augustine had a significant preoccupation with Genesis 1 to 3. And that fits the time that he lived in, the vast transformation. Genesis, it's interesting, as a cultural historian, you can see that when societies are wrestling over their identity, texts around origins or myths around origins form a fundamental topic of conversation. So it tells you something perhaps about our own time to think about. So for Augustine, 5 different commentaries on Genesis 1 to 3. That counts as a preoccupation in my book. He cites Genesis 1:1 more than 700 times, John 1 more than 1,000 times. I haven't even gone through the individual verses. And if you look at all of Genesis 1 to 3, the number of citations, well, that's too much for the likes of me to try and figure out. When I got done with looking at Genesis 1:1, I thought enough. That gives the flavor of his influence. And probably had something. Genesis probably had a significant aspect in his own conversion. If you know something about Augustine's life and his transition from a Christianity of his mother and his father's civil paganism to departure from the church as a teenager who was perhaps a lot brighter than many people around him, critiquing the theology of his culture and rejecting it, to moving into a dualistic Gnostic religion of the Manichees, to then a conversion back to Christianity as sometime around age 30 under the influence of Ambrose and his preaching on Genesis. Because Genesis helps solve core questions for Augustine. This teaching on Genesis helps solve core questions. So he keeps coming back to it. He worked out key questions. He played a fundamental role in working out what he described, and many in the 4th century described in the Latin tradition as factio ex nihilo. We often call that creatio ex nihilo today, but creation out of nothing. The Latin word that they would have used in the 4th century, Augustine certainly used primarily, was factio, to make out of nothing. And he works out this idea, this core theological vision of formation, deformation, and reformation as understanding both the individual and society. And in the midst of doing this, he works out a 3-fold structure for understanding Genesis that becomes really fundamental to his understanding, in a way that would influence the tradition, become influential for the development of history of science in some ways, because it was quite influential in the run-up to early modern scientists. Galileo cites Augustine's commentary on Genesis extensively in his letters to the cardinal and particularly the letter to the Grand Duchess Christiana. So it plays an important role, this way of thinking, more broadly. So for Augustine, Genesis 1 does not, first off, he doesn't think of a literal 6 days or a literal 24-hour days. For him, the days of creation are not about the act of creation as such. It's not a narrative of creation. It's a narrative of God's intent for creation. So it is a story indicating what God intends the cosmos to be for. And he understands it, and he says this in The City of God, as a way of God educating the angels, the angelic realm, about why he's made the earth and the humans. And so it's to convey its primary, in some ways, the primary audience for Genesis 1 to 3 for Augustine. They're not humans, but the angels. Now, you can make of that as you will. But it's an interesting, put that into context of how we have people interpreting Genesis today in different forms. It's a surprisingly different approach. And he understands Genesis, the Genesis 3 chapters, to fundamentally represent 3 moments of creation. The first moment actually is before Genesis begins, because for Augustine, God is immutable and changeless, and therefore God's thinking is changeless. So he wouldn't have God deliberating. You wouldn't have God thinking 3 eyes, 2 eyes. What's the best function? If there is this absolute blueprint that God envisions from all time. And so what lies behind Genesis isn't described in Genesis is this function of a blueprint. Now you can see this in part coming out of a sense of a Platonized tradition, but that's more than that. It's this deep sense of a deep commitment to the goodness of God and the changelessness of God. And so you can't have God, if you think God isn't going to change, you can't have God deliberating. You can't have God weighing up various options, if that is a core commitment. What that leads to is, in Genesis 1, a description of the eternal reasons. These are something like, and were appropriated later on in the 16th and 17th century as notions of natural law. That God, in Genesis 1, is creating the underlying substrate or structures of the physical universe. They are not themselves physical, but define the functions of the physical. And that Genesis 1 represents this creation. Genesis 2, for him, was the administration of that. And so those are the spermatic reasons, the seminal reasons. And for him, this now functions as the implementation of these natural laws, if you will. Put natural laws in quotes, please, air quotes. But putting the implementation of these laws into the physical realm. And so he would think about it in terms of some of the traditional examples of why does an oak tree grow from an acorn? Why is it consistent? So he thinks about a consistent pattern of growth where you have these reasons that are created. Now, this gives Augustine a means for explaining the ongoing governance of activity in nature. And he doesn't think that all of these reasons were evident immediately. So some of the physical reasons, now all the Genesis 1 natural reasons were created all at once. Those were immediate creation. There's no transition of time, but they are implemented over time. And so the implementation for him could take long generations. There's no clear. So it's interesting. Augustine starts to be, in the 19th century, Genesis was largely, his commentaries on Genesis were not paid close attention to until after Darwin. And starting in 1879, you start to get a series of articles of various theologians and scholars of different sorts pulling up Augustine, using Augustine either in favor of or in contradiction of their view of Darwin, because he offers a position that seems to that does allow for some variation. He even says there are some. This is how he accounts for miracles. Some of these seminal reasons actually were not even implemented originally and take place over time. and are not discovered till much later. So he uses this to describe how miracles could occur. So Christ isn't, in walking on water, isn't breaking a law of nature. He's implementing a law of nature that had up to that point been hidden or unused, had been dormant and called out only at that time. So there's no breakage of nature. There's only continuity. So they're not always evident. They're not always employed for a particular purpose. And he presents this to argue for the ongoing operations in nature. Now, this is really important on another realm. One of the things I'm working on now is the transition from organic to mechanistic views of nature. Philosophers of science will often think that Descartes suddenly created, Descartes-Boyle-Locke, suddenly created a mechanistic universe. And up until that point, everybody thought in terms of the universe being animated or organic. It's really clear in late antiquity, amongst the Christians working through notions of creation out of nothing, that they're not working out of an animated universe. You can't have a functional, developed idea of creation out of nothing and an animated universe. Those two actually don't work together. Now, there's a transition. It's not that they suddenly realized this, but over the course of some 4 centuries, the development of thought led them to, in a sense, reject organic views of nature. So, and you see this within Augustine. He's got this sense of a development of natural causes moving over time. So you have these causes underlying the function of the earth, so of the world. So like this quote I have from his commentary on Genesis: God moves his whole creation by a hidden power, and all creatures are subject to the movement. Stars moving in their courses, the winds blowing on earth, meadows coming to life, their seeds putting forth grass. You get this sense of a development of nature, now still as initially implemented by God, but a nature that has some of its own coherence and structure and reality. And that comes out even more in some other quotes. So it's thus that God unfolds the generations, which he laid up in creation. That's interesting. That's the word he uses for creation there is secula. We get our word secular out of that. When first he found it, and they would not send forth or run their courses if few made creatures cease to exercise his provident administration. This is not providence in a very particular deterministic notion. This is providence as an underlying substrate that enables the world to exist. Or he says this, that the sacred writer wasn't ignorant of the nature and order of the elements. Interesting, he's using there the Stoic notion of elements. Stoics were the great physicists of the late antique world, and Augustine is very much influenced by their work, the Stoic physics. Well, perhaps one other quote, and then I'll move on to some implications. The whole course of nature that we're so familiar with has certain natural laws of its own, according to which both the spirit of life, which is a creature, has drives and urges that are somehow predetermined, which even a bad will cannot bypass, and also the elements of the material world that have their distinct energies and qualities which determine what each or each is not capable of. Now you can read on with that quote, but what I want you to get a sense of is this: he's developing a sense that there are patterns or structures in nature, that they, as coming from an originate design. So Augustine presents us with a natural world that is created, it's contingent, it's rational, and critically, and this would be one of the ways in which he gets appropriated in the by the early modern sciences, is that it is also rational and capable of being understood. That there is a coherence between God's intention, this initial design, the structure as it developed. I won't use evolved. You could use evolved, but I won't use it here because that comes to mean something else in our world. And the way we think. And so it's understandable. And it's also worthy of at least some attention. It's out of this that Augustine coined the phrase, the language of the two books. So you perhaps know the two books analogy, the book of nature and the book of biblical revelation. It's Augustine who created this, who coined this term, or at least the first to use it in print. Maybe picked up from someone else, but he's the first to use it. And it's this theological framework that enables it. So you have a nature that's wholly distinct from a creator. It's not enchanted, it's not animated. Again, so this moves us from an organic view of nature, of nature's causes. Not yet, I'm not saying it's a mechanistic. We're not into Cartesian mechanism, but there's obviously an intermediate point between the two. It's not, you can't simply go from an organic view to a mechanistic view in one simple step, as is sometimes suggested. This also gives a different way to approach the problem of evil. So I've been doing some building blocks here to get to be able to answer the question. Now, Augustine works through a notion of evil as a privation. If you're not familiar with privation as an approach to the problem of evil, privation means a lack of the good. So instead of saying that evil is something, theistic traditions would have a real problem with saying that evil is something. Why? Well, where in a theistic tradition do all some things come from? God. So this is true for Judaism, for Islam, for Christianity. To assert that evil is something, whether it be a demonic something in its origin and its essence, creates particular havoc. It's a significant problem that's plagued us. And Hume picked up on that brilliantly in his famous triadic assertion. So that creates havoc. So Augustine is rethinking this. And this has been really, this underlies almost all of Augustine's works. I don't know of any substantive work of Augustine. I have not read, I've read a lot of Augustine. I haven't read all. You should be a bit concerned if anyone tells you that they read all. I don't know I only know one person, my mentor, Gerald Bonner, who asserted that and whom I believed. And I definitely believe Gerald on that. But I've read a lot of Augustine, and his, aside from small fragments or very short works like a short letter, the problem of evil shows up in every single work I've read. He is wrestling with it. It is the thing that drove him from the church. It's the resolution of which brought him back to the church. It is the significant doctrinal position for him. So God creates substances. He creates things. Evil is the unmaking of a thing. The Oxford fantasists got this right. So you know Tolkien. Where do orcs come from? They're distorted elves they're twisted. It's like for those of us who ride our bicycles in Oxford and Cambridge, if you ride it much, you're going to over time acquire a fair bit of rust. Evil is the corrosion. It's the undoing. It starts with something that's good, and it corrodes or undermines its integrity. But it doesn't undermine it so absolutely that you've got nothing left. So I have, having had a number of bikes stolen in Oxford, which probably later on showed up here in Cambridge, I kept looking for it to come back to Oxford, and they didn't. I now keep a really old bike at my office for when I need to ride into the exam schools for a lecture or something. So if I lock it up, if it gets stolen, I'm not much bothered by it. It's got a terrible chain. It squeaks. I hate riding. I love bicycling. I do a lot of distance cycling. I like good equipment. I hate this bicycle. Except I'm pretty certain no one's going to steal it, or if they do, I don't care. It still works. As bad as the bicycle is, as much as it squeaks, as much as the chain jams up and I get frustrated and angry with it, the bicycle still gets me from point A to point B, if not as pleasantly. And that is how Augustine understands the nature of evil. Undermines the integrity. It's the corruption. It's the corrosion. It's the destruction. This is why someone like John Hick thought, well, therefore, all physical phenomena reflects this kind of corrosion. So when we see, whether it be disease or a volcanic eruption in the Christian, now Hick himself didn't think that, Augustine thought that, but this is why he paused that. For the Augustine tradition, all negative physical phenomena must, for a Christian, be the result of the fall. And that's why I ended up then in my dilemma. And why arguing that somehow the world is distorted. Now it's important to know, this idea of corruption, it undermines often in our understanding of science. We talk around issues of information. What it does is it distorts the information. It's an underlying, an undermining of the information we work with. It's almost like if I were to take this nice poster, sorry, and invite you to come to the lecture or lectures. It's a distortion, but you still have something there to work with, right? You can figure out it's Faraday. You can see that you might be able to see a day on there. It's this undermining. And privation is then this kind of decay. It's this removal of good. It's less good. But it's not absolutely evil, is it? Hold it up. Why is it not absolutely evil? URL. Yeah, it's got URL, so that's good enough. There's still something there. In privation theory, if something is absolute evil, what's left? Nothing. As long as there's something, there is some degree of goodness. Because, now he makes a fundamental assumption, which you can agree or disagree with, but he has a fundamental assumption that all existence comes from God. So to the extent that something exists, to that extent it is good. So evil is a relative deprivation of the good. So there's some degree of good left. As long as there's something there, there's some degree of good left. And this is true within this frame of thinking for whatever level of evil you're talking about, from something that's very minor evil to something that could be the most evil thing you could conceive of. There is some element of good left in it. Now that shapes his whole theological vision. If you're familiar with his view of the state and the city of God, that explains the whole book of the city of God. You can't understand his political philosophy without understanding how he handles this notion of privation. You can't understand his view of hermeneutics and Christian instruction and the nature of language and symbols unless you understand this position. It's fundamental to his theological framework. So he says this, it was made in the Confessions. It was made clear to me all things are good, even if they're corrupted. They couldn't be corrupted if they were supremely good, but unless they're good, they could not be corrupted. Now, I've got a lot of text and only a little bit of time. Let me just move through this next bit really quickly so we have some time for conversation. So he understands that humans have lost something as a result of the fall. We've lost this natural state. We humans have been corrupted. As Augustine talks about the nature of privation, he talks about it consistently in a context of beings that have soul, those that have will and can make decisions. So he nowhere talks about this kind of corruption about that I can find. Now again, there's a lot of Augustine, so maybe he'll go out and find a text I haven't seen, and that's possible. I don't expect it to happen, but it's possible. I have to allow for that. Augustine, nowhere that I can find. I've done a lot of searching, both doing a significant amount of reading, but also there are some very good tools for working with the Latin text for doing complex Boolean searches. He nowhere talks about the physical world in its own right being somehow corrupted or privated. Privation, this is the mistake that Hick made. Privation is something that's used to describe what angels and humans do. It's about a moral conversation, not about a physical or physiological topic. And that's a significant change. And he even just takes items and talks about things that we would think are bad under the prior definition and describes it as being. So he thinks the viper was part of God's original creation. So the viper doesn't get its poison as a result of the fall, which is what others would have thought. That would have been a traditional Christian interpretation of those working within this theological tradition. So you don't have somehow the viper getting poison. The viper had poison. So what changes as a result of the fall for Augustine is humanity's relationship to the physical world. Not the physical world itself, but somehow we relate differently to it. Our will is perverted, and we engage with that will, with what is around us, differently as a result of the perversions that are the alienation that's within us. A lot of evidence of that. He even distinguishes very specifically between decay that's in a natural state of decay and privation. So that decay for him, he talks about decay. Augustine, it's just a clear philosophical way of thinking, clear way of understanding ontology. For Augustine, indeed, as it was for Athanasius, the great Greek church father, and for the Cappadocian theologians, anything that can be made will necessarily decay. Now, this is not don't think of him as creating an early version of the rule of entropy. He's not doing that. But it's, in some ways, there's a kind of interesting comparison. Anything that can be made has to decay, because otherwise God is making his equal. God doesn't make something that's decayless, because that's making something that's immutable. So Augustine understands decay in nature as being something essential to a natural substance, to the natural workings of the world. And that changes then how we think about this. He even thinks about this in terms of, at one point he talks about the difference between light and dark, and he says the light, and he's using this both in a moral sense and in a physiological sense, that the dark parts of the world help us understand the light parts. And he uses this to explain the fragmentation in nature, that the fragmentary parts of nature help us understand what is good and right and true. And so he sees this as part of a bigger vision of reality. Now, let me get to some conclusions so we can take some questions. I think this is something that's interesting and important in its own right. So for me, first off, back to my ennui, my moment of potential epiphany and disconcerted waking up to, am I contradicting myself? Am I living a contradiction to both work within an Augustinian theological tradition and maintain the best understanding we have today of physical and biological evolution? Well, within this, no. I didn't. This was actually a great research project for me, because it's one where I really had a lot at stake for myself that I had to work through. But actually, there isn't a contradiction there. The contradiction was a tradition that had misinterpreted Augustine, set it up. And so that's the second part. Actually, I have it as my first point here, but I'm moving into it as the second point. This gives us a case study, I think, to think through how we engage with the Christian tradition. Because often we think, especially with major authors, whether it be Augustine or Luther or Paul, or we think in terms of the tradition of scientific authors who are part of our canon, whether it be Galileo. We think in terms of a tradition, and we frame and shape a tradition, and we think this tradition tells us we ought to think and act and believe in such a way. Well, to an extent that can be true. But it does mean we have to be prepared to evaluate. The tradition sometimes steps aside. We make decisions and judgments thinking it must be the case. It made sense to Hick that Augustine ought to think in this way, because if you read parts of Augustine, it's suggestive of that. But suggestive wasn't sufficient. He could have read deeper and found the contradiction. So it's a case study of how we can let the tradition misconstrue our position. And so I found in Augustine terms it's wrong to describe violent physical and biological acts in nature as evil. I think one of the problems, and this is another a salutary lesson for me out of this, we create terminology that sometimes sets us up to have problems. So take, for example, the word, I think a very big one for me here that set me up, was the phrase natural evil. Now that's a term, as far as I can tell, first comes from Leibniz. Someone may know where it began. The earliest I found it so far is Leibniz. To use the language of natural evil suggests that a tornado or a disease is an evil thing. And it puts us in our mind that somehow it is morally bankrupt and ill-conceived and is part of our problem in some very big, vast way. Not just something that's going to be harmful to me physically, but something that's actually more deeply problematic. Well, I think the problem here is the coining of this phrase, natural evil. It's not Augustinian. It doesn't represent Augustine's thought, because for Augustine, fighting against his Manichaean past, the Gnostic past that he rejects absolutely any sense that nature is used as a source of evil. That was the Gnostic position, that the physical world we live in is itself wrong and evil. And Augustine just rejects that lock, stock, and barrel. It's just not plausible in an Augustinian sense in any way. And so I think we have to be careful of some of the phrases that we take for granted in the history of thought that shape us and shape our reaction. For Augustine, originate purity is found in spiritual reasoning beings, not as part of the description of the physical existence in the corporeal world. Purity is a moral state, not an ontological state in a sense. And so we can wrestle with the ontology, that is, what is nature that we're working with, in a different sense, not infusing it with a necessary moral. Now, I'm not saying that let me clarify that a little bit. I'm not saying that there is no place within the providence of God, or that natural things can't be used for good or evil, but to understand it as existing in its own right in a moral state to be defined in this way is problematic in an Augustinian sense. Interestingly, you will find often here in the history of thought that the 12th century is the discovery of the natural world. Well, it's during this time that they're actually rediscovering Augustine. I think we have, as well as some of the Cappadocians. And I think it's a rediscovery of the natural world in the 12th century. And in advance upon what they thought, new things being brought out, but some of the groundwork was already done. Augustine can allow for change and variance, except in originate design. For example, here's one implication of this. I think Augustine would have real problems with thinking through emergence as a viable option in Christian theology. At least the full sense of emergence as used, that any particular creature could have become an ensouled thinking creature that could carry out the divine mandate. I think he would have had a problem with that. But he can nonetheless allow for a change in variance within the framework of an originate design. I'm not talking about intelligent, but when I say design, please don't confuse that with intelligent design, by the way, as used in the last 50 years. So, after the fall, humans are alienated from creation, but nowhere do I find Augustine saying that the corporeal world itself has metamorphosed into something else. Augustine does not present that language that I can find. Now, you may find it. Email me. Let me know where you find a contradiction. But I can't find in Augustine through all my reading of that. Well, I don't think Augustine held that we can argue that Augustine held that creation was alienated from God. He just doesn't argue that. For your reading pleasure, there's a famous statement Augustine uses in Genesis 1:19 on being careful about what one says about nature. It's been used and picked up by many a historian and author in science and religion, and for your reading pleasure while we talk. Let me stop it there. Sorry. A few minutes long.
Great, thank you very much. Now, there's left some time for questions. Who would like to kick off? Alice, just in front of you there on your right.
Sorry, I wasn't just, thank you so much for that, but I wasn't completely clear whether Augustine was regarding human death as something which was a result of sin. Can you just clarify?
Yeah. So for I didn't go into that, and let me just say I can say a bit more about that, because that's a convoluted one. Augustine believed that humans were intended to live beyond, but there was a sense that needed a constant infusion of grace. So human death requires, and he sees the tree of life in the garden as representing that. So there's a need of a constant infusion of grace of a life-giving grace to maintain. And so for him, the irony is that Adam and Eve turned themselves away from that which would give life. And so their moral death, that is in choosing evil over good, led to a physical death, but not by God causing them then to die, but removing them from this life-giving the life-giving grace, as represented by the tree of life. Whether he thought literally a tree of life or not is another matter. Does that answer?
Yeah. So, in other words, human death is completely different from animal death.
Yes, because he would have seen, because he did believe. He does this in the City of God. It's almost like a failure. There's a little bit of a sense in the way he treats it as a failure to launch. That had humans, he says in the City of God, I think this is book 21. Sorry, I'm not remembering exactly right now. That had they sustained in their, had they continued on in grace, had they followed the law, had they obeyed, a further and greater grace would have been given, which would have confirmed them in life, and they failed to receive that. And so it's a failure to receive continuation of life.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. If I understand correctly, the conflict that you encountered when you started to study Augustine was that if the world was fallen, then no good of further evolution of species could follow from that.
Yes, sorry, that assumes a certain thing. So we built into the whole evolutionary synthesis is animal predation and a long history of animal predation. So you either then have to put the fall at the moment of the Big Bang or something, I don't know what. But as we understand every bit of evolutionary development, it's accompanied by some form of violence, whether it be the move of tectonic plates leading to earthquakes, or I'm not talking necessarily moral violence, but they're violent activities which have impact. And there is a tradition of within some Christian thought of saying that this all came after the fall, like somehow only earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and Ebola began after the fall.
Sure. So the way that you responded in your lecture, I understand, was you said that what changes as a result of the fall is man's relation to the physical world. One of the things that I recall from what little I know about Augustine is that in De Trinitate, he prioritizes the relations of the divine persons of the Trinity over the substance, and by extension, relations over substance in general.
Yes.
And this suggests, moreover, then that the relations that obtain between the angels in their collaborative activity of creation, as well as humans in their subcreation, is also relational. If that's the case, then it suggests that creation is also composed of the relations made by angels and men. And if that's true, then you might say that I would suggest that there's a kind of indirect constitutiveness of our relational activities with which the physical world is created and changed by angelic and human activity. I wonder if that would complicate the picture that you're drawing out.
No, actually, I think it supports it directly, because what it is, again, what he's saying is our relationship to the cosmos, our moral alteration changes how we relate to the physical or physiological, and we can affect it negatively. So I think your position, had I heard it years ago and thought that through, I wouldn't have had as much problem had I not paid so much attention to certain other authors.
Okay, and just pause you there, and then we'll move forward to the front.
Right, I have a short and quick one, which is, if your conclusion is correct, then will you affirm the opposite, which is that if someone wants to suggest nature intrinsically or some evil that can be natural, then it follows that such a position cannot be totally theologically compatible with a creation, doctrine of creation, where God is the originator of all that is good. Are you affirming the converse, meaning that meaning that if you don't hold an Augustinian Christian theology, will you be able to find a third way which enables you to have a notion of sort of natural evil or some kind of notion of nature that has been affected by the fall, while still maintaining that God is the creation of all that is good? So I'm asking whether you would allow any alternatives than the two that you have entertained.
Yeah, now you're asking me to move out of my historian's hat into my, I can't retreat into being a mere historian, a simple historian. There are a number of different ways of approaching it, and some like to, my Oxford colleague Swinburne likes to bring out the Irenaean option as opposed to Augustine. Actually, they're not that far opposed. It's not just a simple opposition between the two. On top of that, it's a little bit hard to know what Irenaeus really fully thought, since we only have such a fragmentary part of his writing available. So I'm not willing to make that big a judgment on that small a corpus. I think there are multiple other positions one can take. I think the problem comes where I would struggle. So you're asking me in terms of my position, how I engage with it. I would have significant problems with a way of seeing the cosmos as being itself fundamentally, in some sense, evil. And that's what Augustine was rejecting. That's a position that I was going to say I find attractive. It's stronger than that. I find compelling. That I can allow that difficult things happen and deeply painful things happen. And we have in this room masses of, if we started and we're honest, we'd have a massive number of stories to tell of painful things that have happened through the cosmos, from disease to accidents to brokenness. And so it's not an innocence or naivete about the pain that's out there. What this does is it distinguishes between the pain that is a part of the world and moral, spiritual disarray and internal disarray that is a pain of the world. So that, many of us in the room have known someone who is going through some horrible thing, some horrible physiological thing, and yet they've got a spirit of grace and generosity and peace about them that's transcendent. They've been able to distinguish between the pain, the physiological and the spiritual, and their spirit transcended the particular. Now, not all of us have the ability or grace to do that, but we perhaps have known people who can. And so I find it compelling and important to really think more carefully than what this tradition I'm rejecting has done of how we think about the physical world. There are various other options, but what I'm trying to do here is say Augustine doesn't support certain positions. And what he certainly doesn't support are those, and there are many of colleagues I've got, who would trot out Augustine against evolution. And the fundamental thing to say here is Augustine's not helping you. Now, there are certain aspects or arguments one might make from Augustine that particularly challenge certain evolutionary interpretations. That's fine. But to have a wholesale sense that someone reared in Augustine tradition ought to reject evolution, therefore fill in the blank of what other alternative you want to use, well, that's just not available. That's my fundamental position here.
I think I'll take one last quick question. It'll have to be a quick one.
Thank you. The power, the independence, and the intelligence of an evil thing or influence is apparent even in the beginning of Genesis in the snake. How do you explain that?
So that comes directly for Augustine. So I'm going to give you Augustine's thinking. That's since I'm representing Augustinian thought here. For Augustine, that represents that it was created by God to have those sorts of things. And so the power of something comes directly from the strength of its creative structure. And so the ability to organize. So evil that's well organized can do more evil than something that's evil that's just chaotic or simple. And so the power comes from its created nature, but it's the distortion of it. It's misusing, for Augustine, the good gifts that were given it. So given the ability to decide, to think, to organize, to structure, to relate, to communicate, all those things were then distorted and used against its good purpose in the story of the snake. And for Augustine then, there's a kind of irony, I suppose you would say, that evil is making its way forward by misusing the very gifts it's been given by its created nature. And it's the power of its created nature that enables that strength. So what we have to do is distinguish between, it doesn't mean to be orderly is to be evil, but order can be misused for evil, right? We've seen plenty of, it's easy to point to certain historic phenomena. Look at how coherently structured and ordered the Nazi regime was in the way it mistreated people. It used order despicably. But it was taking a good thing and distorting it in doing that. And that doesn't mean that order is bad, but for Augustine, order is a gift of God. It is the twisted misuse of it. And that's the thing that should be rejected. That's the thing that should be condemned. It's the misuse. A kind of Augustinian phrase would be, if you will, is that misuse isn't, or abuse isn't an argument against good use or proper use. And so one would want to think through what is the structure and order of a thing in making broader judgments.
Thank you. I think our time is up, so I'll draw things to a close. Would you join me in thanking Stan for really
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.